Reconciliation. For more than 28 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues related to peace, social and economic justice, and nonviolent social change. This month, we will confront our nation's political polarization and explore practical ways to communicate across the political divides so that we can all move forward. When Americans have such sharply different values and worldviews, we lack a common starting point about what is real and what is true. This makes it hard to have rational conversations about controversial issues, and it makes it hard to solve difficult political public policy questions. So we wonder, are we stuck with this kind of polarization, or can we find better ways to respect the basic humanity even of those people with whom we disagree? Of course, we who advocate for particular public policies want to convince people who aren't yet there of that side. But before we can persuade anyone to come toward our direction, we need to find starting points, strategies, and methods that will allow us to become more effective in communicating across the political divide and move the public, the media, and the politicians. Some kinds of strategies and methods work better than others, and we should be learning from what works. We have 3 guests in the TCTV studio to help us explore this topic. All have decades of experience, skilled in many aspects of this, and they have a lot of wise insights. I'm looking forward to the conversation with these 3 folks. Michael Savoca has volunteered as an advocate for a wide variety of public policy issues and draws from a variety of other experiences, including working with young people who've run afoul of the law. I've enjoyed having Michael tell some of his stories and experiences and insights into how to do this, and that'll be fun to have Michael on the program. John Van Eenwyk has been a guest several times on this program. He's a PhD clinical psychologist and an Episcopal priest. He has solid experience working with people who have suffered from political and physical violence in many parts of the world, and founded the International Trauma Treatment Program, which we've focused on our TV series. As a clinical psychologist, he has experience working with people who are having difficulties. Regan Unsold draws from decades of experience as a highly dedicated and creative classroom teacher who has helped students grapple with controversial issues. He's volunteered at the local, state, and national levels of the Teachers Union, and he's volunteered in many other community-level issues and activities supporting democracy and human rights. It's good to have you as a guest.
Thank you.
So let's start by exploring this political polarization that I referenced in the introduction. Michael, do you think that we have become more polarized in the political discourse in this country?
I think it's real, unfortunately. It seems to be real from the elected officials that I've known over the years, and from the things that I've experienced. I'm not exactly a young person. And it seems that there was a time in our country where people of different, people across the aisle could, play together, talk to each other. They would try to find, even though they had differences, some degree of overlap, some degree of common ground, and they would work towards generating policy. There seems to be forces afoot in our society that are pulling us apart. It might be the specialization of work. It might be that political parties have changed their strategies. These are things that we need to explore.
Regan, what do you think has resulted from that kind of polarization? Are there things that you've seen?
Well, I think that to a great extent it has rendered the legislative process, which in many respects is necessarily the art of finding common ground, finding agreement, compromise, it has rendered that quite difficult, almost impossible. And that has political ramifications in that there are those in our society who express the view that government needs to be shrunk, government is dysfunctional, government is the problem. And when you have a dysfunctional government, which people of that view often have contributed to creating, it serves that agenda.
Yeah,
whereas
self-fulfilling prophecy.
In many respects, yeah. Whereas those of us who believe government has a positive role to play, that's a challenge.
Yeah.
It's a problem.
John, when we were preparing for to do this interview, you mentioned some changes a few decades back in how TV news functions. Tell us about the FCC.
Yes, well, I was thinking about Michael when he was talking about days when we did have more cross-dialogue, and in those days, our youth, we had something called the equal time provision, which was government mandated that any organization that was in the media, newspaper, television, radio, would have to provide equal time to opposing points of view. During the Reagan administration, that was one of the first things that was overturned by the FCC. So we no longer have any obligation to introduce other points of view other than the one that any particular media outlet is promoting at the moment.
Yeah, and then you also say that it used to be that the networks recognized the kind of the public service need to have good TV news coverage, and so they subsidized that from other revenue that the networks generated. And then a while back,
about 35 years ago,
they made news have to carry its own weight, which
pay for itself.
Changed the way they cover things.
Right.
Infotainment.
Yes. So now, and the way to get people to watch it and to buy the products that they advertise is to get people's ire up, to get their viscera up. So it's actually a form of pornography.
Yeah, and you also said, Regan, that you get sort of this false balance where there's something that's actually factual and substantive, but then there's somebody on the other side and they feel like they have to give equal weight to both.
You do have media outlets that do put forward a form of equal time, so to speak.
It's a false balance.
It's often a false balance where you might have one perspective that in fact is heavily supported by available evidence and another viewpoint that is not, but they're both presented as equivalent in validity and weight and so on and so forth. And so that's another downside or another aspect of the media world in which we live.
Climate change.
Yeah, we see that where the virtual consensus of scientists says one thing and a few deniers funded by the oil company
get equal weight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. John, you told me that somebody who is polarized tends to have an absolutist assumption.
Yes.
That there's really only one solution and they haven't.
Yes.
Tell us about that approach.
Well, psychologists, we're always looking for the origin of something. So we're looking at why the polarization is there, what basically inherent in the human animal makes it occur. And one of them is the way we learn. The way we learn in the West, the way we know what we know, what's called epistemology, is done through eliminating alternatives to the one absolute question. We have something that's very complex, we narrow it down to a very simple answer, and that's the answer that, for example, all of us when we were in high school and junior high had to put down on the test. We would get a question about world history that was very complex, but there was only one answer, and we'd have to put that one answer down. So we're taught in this culture that complexity is really kind of an illusion, and everything is quite simple and boils down to one. But unfortunately, things are complex. So those other elements have to be represented by somebody, and they are equally one-sided.
And you also told me that people who have that absolutist view, and even people who are extremists about that, tend to think of themselves as more moderate.
Yes.
Tell about these perceptions about who's moderate and who's not.
We all do. We all more or less like to think of ourselves as relatively moderate, as not being as diatribic as the other people. Reasonable. Yes. So there have been studies done of polarization, and what they've discovered pretty much is that people who hold opposing points of view feel that they are less radical than the other side. And not only that, they feel they're less radical than the people on their side. So there's a certain movement on people's part. We all kind of want to be reasonable and we want to be moderate, and it's hard for us to identify ourselves as kind of radical extremists. So that's a real point of opportunity to talk to people.
And you have a sense that the opposite sides sort of feed off each other and need each other.
Well, I think that when I first became aware of this, it was during the Cold War. And you had the hardcore supporters of expanded defense budgets, so-called defense budgets, here in the United States, who were pointing at their counterparts in the Soviet Union, who were hardcore supporters of increasing Soviet expenditures on military. And in a way, they benefited by the existence of the other. And they helped provide the rationale that these different groups are putting forth, to the point where if that other side were not there, they almost need to manufacture it. You know, with the decline of the Cold War, it wasn't, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, communism subsided as that threat that was used to justify military spending and so on and so forth, but wasn't long before it was replaced by militant Islam. So I think there are many examples of that.
Yeah.
That you can see.
Yeah, it's true.
So if we disagree with somebody on the opposite side of an issue, why should we behave in a civil manner?
Well, because they're people just like us, and their views are held by them with as much passion and with as much rationality as ours. So if we want to engage people on the other side, we want to engage their humanity. We want to be able to treat them as people who have a point of view that's worth listening to, that's worth learning about. And in fact, when we ask people to teach us about their point of view, they often then begin to recognize the complexity, and that's where the dialogues can really begin.
Right, and I know we'll talk about how Regan has done this through his high school classes. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But there is potential to get out of that polarization by doing that and the good listening and so forth. Michael, you've recognized that people just differ from each other in various ways, and it's okay to be different from each other.
It is, and just kind of dovetailing with what was just said, I think that there is an equal and very much related reason, besides respect, or in addition to respect for the other person's humanity, as a reason why you don't want to descend into the lower bowels of ugly discourse, and that is that you have a tendency, there's the risk that you pollute yourself, that you corrupt yourself, that you poison yourself. I mean, I think you can reach a point where people are so much at each other in such a high volume kind of a way that, that you do damage to yourself spiritually and emotionally. So I think it's important, almost as a selfish reason with a small s, to kind of keep things calm and keep things balanced. But yes, getting back to your question, I do think that it's important to first and foremost validate, you know, the other person's point of view. And validation doesn't necessarily mean that we agree, but it's saying that you value the other person as a human being enough to try to walk, you know, a ways in their shoes and kind of try on their experience and their way of thinking. That process hopefully encourages them to do the same thing, and that's the beginning of an honest exchange.
Yeah, there are all kinds of differences we have. When we were on the phone preparing for this interview, you mentioned that even that eye contact means different things. Commonly in our culture, people think of eye contact as that's a way to make a connection.
Yes.
But in some cultures, or if there's a power imbalance, if you make eye contact with somebody, like if you are a person of low status, low power in some societies, and you make eye contact with somebody who's of high status, that's an affront to that person. And we don't even realize these things. So understanding the differences is crucial.
And so what you're talking about, I think, is speaking the other person's language. I mean, we have to, there's terminology that can be a bit of a minefield for us. You know, when you have people who have different cultural perspectives and different ideas about all the social things that we face, that we deal with. And yeah, you're right. In terms of eye contact, there are places where eye contact shows respect and attentiveness, and other places where too much eye contact communicates aggressiveness and being overly assertive and challenging.
Yeah.
You have to know the territory.
Right. Regan, you've got a prop that you've used in school, in classrooms, to help students understand that we all have filters.
I carry it everywhere I go.
There we go.
Yeah, so I've been teaching high school social studies now for 30 years, mostly seniors. And on the first day of school, I ask all my students to take their toilet paper rolls out of their backpacks, pockets, purses, and whatnot, and they look at each other. Well, no matter. You might not have the toilet paper roll, but you have the filters that it represents. And so I don't know if the camera can see this or not, but on this toilet paper roll, it says assumptions, beliefs, values, experiences, upbringing, and the all-important, etc. And so I use this to symbolize that we see the world as we do based on these things. And in my classes, we wrestle with controversial issues, and we do so by looking at multiple sides. Those of you that like your world nice and neat, black and white, all tied up, I'm so sorry for you, because this class is going to be very challenging because we take a multiple perspective approach. And it's one of the values of it, I think. Well, so the way it works is that I'm looking at someone now digging a hole on the side of a road in rural Afghanistan and planting an explosive device that they plan to blow up when soldiers come by, including USCN soldiers, and definitely a T-word, terrorist. But you flip it around, same scene, and suddenly it's, I teach high school, the double F word, freedom fighter. So who is that, terrorist or freedom fighter? And so that becomes a sort of metaphor for the fact that we're going to have strongly different opinions with each other. How do we create a safe place where everybody can feel heard, understood, and respected? And what's nice about this is that it separates the person from their views. We tend to conflate, we tend to combine the two and judge somebody for their views. We judge the person. And this helps, so it leads to, so why do you see the world as you do, which is so different from the way I see it, and it makes so much sense the way I see it? And so it leads to a conversation about, so how did you come to have those views rather than how could you possibly have those views? And it's very useful.
Read those again, because I think that's a great list.
Assumptions, the things we think are true, although we may not have any evidence. The beliefs, which are the things we know are true, although we might not have any evidence for that either. Our values, right, wrong, so on, experiences, upbringing, and the all-important, et cetera. So I invite students to share other filters that might be influencing them. And so
it's a very useful metaphor, and because if we're talking, if we're going to talk politics or any issue with people
Religion.
anything, you know, it's helpful to recognize that different people are coming from different places, and if we're going to make progress, even just as a civilized society, to have a conversation, let alone change public policy in one way or another.
Absolutely. One of the things that's coming out here that you put out very well, and you've mentioned too, is the whole idea of if we identify people with their viewpoints, they will do the same. Yeah. And then they become identified with their viewpoints. So if we challenge the viewpoint, we're challenging them, their whole being. So we want to move beyond that.
Polarization.
Yeah, you get labeled. I mean, we have 4 white men.
Oh yeah,
we do. Of a certain age category, you know, so we could be dismissed.
How did that happen?
For that. we could be dismissed as irrelevant.
There's some selection going on.
Well,
yeah, you're right.
I tried to get a different mix of guests. I knew I wanted to get Michael out here because we had talked about this some months ago.
I said that as a joke.
No, but I knew I wanted to get you, and then I tried to get some other guests, and this is who we ended up with. Yes. Nothing wrong with this selection. But if we were to do the same topic again, we could have some totally different combination, and that would still be just as valid.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there'd be other viewpoints because other people have different toilet paper rolls.
And it might be interesting to do it again with a different collection of people and see the directions that it goes in.
I want to explore. Go ahead.
No, I was just commenting. Put that you could have a very different show.
I want to explore a remedy. We want to move from sort of the problems. We're moving into the remedies. How can we make progress? There's a remedy that all 3 of you had emphasized when we were on the phone talking. I made individual phone calls with each of you, and each of you mentioned this next thing, but in a slightly different way, but compatible, and it had to do with honestly trying to understand the other person and practicing good listening skills. So John, for example, you expressed the suggestion that we should see the people on the other side as people of goodwill who are worthy of having a conversation with.
Right. That's not just something that we would fabricate. That's true. They are people of goodwill, and they do have something interesting for us to learn. And so if we engage them as that, then their self-esteem is intact. They don't feel they're being attacked before their views. They're being genuinely engaged. And it's a much more human way to do things, because generally we're all pretty good people.
Yeah. And so if your human dignity is not being attacked, then that sort of frees you up to get on with the substance of it, rather than get all defensive and retaliate by name calling or whatever.
Absolutely, because here's someone who cares about what we think, so we want to share that with them. Absolutely.
It frees them up to also acknowledge the humanity of yourself.
Just like what you were saying, Michael.
Yeah. So Regan, you told me on the phone that you want people to be understood and valued, and so we should listen for the emotional aspects of what they're saying and not put them on the defensive.
Yeah. So when we're talking about controversial issues, in addition to trying to ascertain, so what is it in your life that led you to this view? And Glenn, if you could repeat your question again, just.
Okay. Yeah. You when we were talking about when preparing for the program. You talked about people want to be understood and valued, so we should listen for the emotional aspects of what they're saying and not put them on the defense.
Yeah, so often if you're simply arguing purported facts and not addressing the underlying values, issues, or beliefs that gives that person the passion or emotion that they attach to that particular issue, it's probably not going to be a very constructive conversation. And so I encourage my students when we do exercises in the classroom to listen for the values that the other person is expressing, to listen for the emotions that you can then validate that, wow, this is really important for you because of this experience that you had. I want to honor that. I hear you in that. And so then as you begin to feel less defensive or less under attack, it allows you to then begin to explore the factual basis. But oftentimes the affective is more important than the,
Could I comment on that?
concrete details.
I think what you're saying is so true and so important, because until you acknowledge, validate, whatever term best suits the situation, those emotions, those values, those feelings, what happens is the volume on those feelings, left unvalidated, gets turned up. I'm going to turn that volume up until you respect it, recognize it, validate it. And so it's in the process of saying to somebody that, you know, we can appreciate how they feel about this, and that it's important to them and why it's important to them, that we can keep that very, I don't want to call it a monster, but it has the potential of becoming a monster, kind of under control, because it's what we would hopefully want to do is at least have a balanced conversation between the rational and the emotional. Certainly I don't want to go someplace where the emotional overwhelms the rational, and that's where we can end up if we don't do what Regan just said, and that's where we validate and understand and appreciate the person's emotional set. So I think that's extremely important.
And Michael, you also talked about the importance of at some point early in the conversation to seeking a buy-in for engaging in a real conversation. So the other person is making a real choice to engage in a real conversation.
Yeah, there are times that I want to know from somebody, do you really want to have a conversation? You know, I mean, which means an exchange of ideas. Or do you want to beat me? Do you want to win? Because I go into a lot of these discussions with really the heartfelt belief that I'm a very fallible person, and that more often than not, I get taught a lesson somewhere along the way in the conversation. And so I encourage other people to share that point of view, because it's with that point of view that we can have a constructive exchange of ideas. Without that, and if they're not saying, yeah, I'm willing to have an honest conversation with you, let's explore these ideas, let's put these beliefs on the table, sure, I'll go down that road with you. But some people want to fight. I mean, it's been my experience that some people don't want that buy-in. They don't want to give that buy-in, and we have to recognize that. If what they want is a shouting match, or they want to vent their spleen, or you know, they want pyrotechnics as opposed to, you know, an honest exchange of ideas. I just want to have that understanding right up front. I prefer the buy-in.
So the good listening really does work. There's a story I want to just share briefly that we experienced in Tacoma. I do a lot of work on opposing the death penalty, and we put out an information table and engage the public at public events to talk about the death penalty. And the sign across the front of the booth, instead of making a demand, abolish the death penalty, which is what we really hope will happen, we ask a question on the banner that says, are you troubled by the death penalty? So by asking a question instead of making a demand, it lets people know that we're actually interested in having a conversation.
Yes.
And I was briefing a new volunteer at a Tacoma public event and explaining to this person that we really do practice good listening. We want to find out where the person's coming from and kind of go with them on what their starting point is. And right after we did that, the first person that came along was a middle-aged woman who saw the sign and came up and said, yeah, she really does support the death penalty. She's not much troubled by it, except that she's Catholic. She realizes the Catholic social teaching opposes the death penalty, but she still had reasons why she needed to hold on to that. And she was talking with our volunteer at the booth, who was a very good listener, and just kind of worked with her on this. And they talked for, like 10, 15 minutes, and by the time the conversation ended and the woman left, she said, well, I'm going to go back and study that Catholic social teaching again. So here, she had started out at the sort of toward the opposite pole, ended up kind of in the middle, and because she had been affirmed in her values as her starting point, she was willing to dig a little deeper on that after that conversation was ending. Well, that's good, because we're not going to make a convert from one extreme to the other extreme. We're going to move people a little bit incrementally along, but the main thing is at least we can let people know that even if they still think that we're wrong at the end of the conversation, at least we're nice people to talk with. It's that common humanity that may be just all you can get out of a conversation, but that's enough.
And so one of the kernels of truth that you just spoke about, and there was more than one, is that the process of changing a mind, changing an opinion, is just that. It's a process. I mean, if you and I are going to debate something that, you have a heartfelt belief and so do I, and maybe for good reason, the odds are very slim that at the end of the the meeting, at the end of the discussion, at the end of the dinner, that one of us is going to convert. And if we expect that, that's one of the things that leads to that fireworks. But if I'm willing to grant you and you're willing to grant me that this is a process, that this discussion today isn't going to result in a winner or a loser, but we're going to begin a journey. We're going to go down a path, and we're going to explore the death penalty and all of its complexities, and we're going to think about it. And we might come together some time from now and share, you know, how our points of view have changed. It's a process, and it takes time.
But that's a very different model from the polarization that says I'm absolutely right, you're absolutely wrong. And I'm going to denounce you with name calling and whatever else. How did you, beyond the prop that you explained and the other things you've said, how did you do your classroom exercise that really focused on choosing a controversial issue and grappling with it seriously? I know you had that was a major part of.
Well, I begin the year talking about filters and perceptions, and we do a little activity on communication styles, because in my class we want to use assertive communication, taking ownership of our perceptions. And then we select the most controversial and polarizing topic we can come up with. And we use consensus to decide what level of support we need in order to pick our topic. So that's a little complicated, but it's really fun to watch and take part in. And so the class selects the topic, but there are some ground rules that we also adopt by consensus. And one is that we're not going to be permitted to argue or debate with each other. We're not going to be permitted to try to change each other's minds. Because a lot of times, and these are tough topics, abortion, capital punishment, marriage equality, which used to be a very tough topic, but there's not the sort of balance of opinion anymore, so it doesn't really rise up to the level of a good topic. Good topic, a lot of polarization, a lot of passion, a lot of disagreement, but not permitted to try to change each other's mind. And so for a lot of people who are uneasy about why this is not going to work, how are we going to find common ground on this topic? I don't want people to be forcing me to change my belief. How can we deal with that? An operating principle we adopt by consensus saying no one is permitted to try to change anyone's minds. You might change your mind, but we're not permitted to try to change it. And so we call each other out. You know, are you engaging in debate? Well, yeah, not permitted. And with one notable exception, we have always reached common ground on these tough, tough issues. And it's probably one of the more important things that I've done as a teacher. And I think there's great need for it in our larger society.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah, please.
So what's going on isn't another person trying to send and convince the other person, but they're making self-statements? They're simply talking about the way they feel?
So what we do is we identify different interests and values that are associated with the issue and that people with different views about the issue have. And so again, we're purposefully looking for that human element. And then, and so that creates some context. And then we also try to come up with questions that plant seeds of doubt in the other person's view, as well as our own. We have to come up with questions that might, so for example, if you're strongly opposed to abortion, a question might be, do you believe that a woman who has an abortion to save her life should be sent to prison for the rest of her life? And for someone who supports choice, do you believe that a woman who has had multiple abortions and simply refuses to use any sort of contraception and doesn't want a child of this gender and wants to have an abortion, do you support an abortion under those circumstances, or does that cause you some pause? And so you try to come up with really tough questions for people on all sides of the issue, and out of the conversation then emerges areas of common ground. That if you don't support abortion as a gender choice, then we have common ground.
So more exploration, less ego.
Less ego. And what we're often doing is saying, hey folks, does anybody hear the common ground that I just heard in this conversation? And, well, maybe that, yeah. So often possible common ground is right there in front of us. but we don't see it.
You have a lot of fun doing this.
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
I can see your enthusiasm.
Yeah.
That's great.
I'm just moving on after 30 years of it, and I'm going to miss it fiercely.
Yeah.
But our whole society needs that kind of an approach that respects people and respects that kind of a process and respects the openness and the neutrality to actually explore. We don't get that. I mean, those things are not built into any of our societal institutions. You have to generate that out of nothing, as you did, and then it works, so you kept doing it.
And it is a somewhat different dynamic than setting out to try to persuade someone to change their view. But what I have found is that out of that process comes not only greater appreciation for the humanity of people who disagree with us, but also the ability to have those kinds of conversation that can lead to really important shared beliefs. And
It seems to me what's going on here also is that there's an extraction of the fear factor. I could see a young person, I could see myself participating in that process. And anytime you get into a mental tug of war and you get into that win-lose, I've got to win, I've got to beat that person, my idea has to prevail. Anytime two people step into the ring, one person wins, one boxer wins, one loses. It sounds like the process that you're talking about is one where you can set aside any notion of winning or losing or the fear of losing, and so that people can participate more freely.
When I tell students that we're going to be selecting the most controversial issue, we're going to be debating it, right? And I say, well, no, actually, we're going to be dialoguing about it and finding agreement, not disagreement. Even more important than debating.
That's great. It's great stuff. I just love that example.
I love it.
For those who do want to persuade, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to persuade something, because the process that we've been talking about here has to do with remedies for the polarization, apart from persuading, actually, but just depolarizing and allowing this kind of an open exploration for the well-being of the participants and society as a whole. But of course, people do come to these public policy issues with a desire to move public policy toward, let's do this, let's stop this war, let's change this law, let's pass this law, let's whatever. And so we often find ourselves wanting to persuade, and I wonder if we could look at some of these remedies that we've been exploring and apply the ones that are relevant toward the persuasive function. So mutual understanding is good. That's a step toward persuasion, if you want to take it in that way. But there are some other ways that we can do that can help move the person that we're talking with closer toward our viewpoint. And I wonder, do you have strategies or methods?
I do, yes.
For that?
They're not effective all the time, I can tell you. But yeah, sometimes I try to go back. And by go back, I mean instead of taking the issue head on, such as, I believe in the death penalty, you don't. Which I'm making that up. I'm not stating that that's a fact.
Right.
And then instead of meeting that issue head on, to go back and start talking about things that lie underneath and try to get to a point where we have some degree of agreement, some degree of commonality. And so if you can proceed from that point, sometimes it helps to number one, avoid the very contentious, emotionally elated, point-blank question, do you support the death penalty? And start talking about things like equity in criminal justice. Ask questions like, do you think that we really have, and ask the question, do you think we really have equal protection under the law? Do you think that juries, what's your sense? Do you think that juries are relatively infallible when it comes to determining points of fact and guilt and innocence? I would like to know what the other person thinks. And so it's by exploring those things and trying to come up with some degree of commonality. Maybe we might agree, that the juries do a wonderful job. They are correct in points of fact 90% of the time. I mean, imagine if you were a baseball player and you were batting 900. That'd be a pretty good thing. But if juries are wrong 10% of the time, what's the implication for the innocent people who are sent to the gallows or otherwise forfeit their life under color of law? So we try to proceed from a point, a departure from a point of mutual agreement sometimes is effective.
Let's see. we've got so many things. Anything else from anybody about?
Yes, I think that one of the things that you mentioned as well, is this whole idea of finding common ground. And I think one of the most important common grounds that we can find with other people is our own vulnerability in terms of our values. When people's values are confronted and when people's values are contradicted and even diminished, that hurts us. We feel bad about that. So to talk from our own personal experience of the issues we're talking about is very important. For example, I have a very good friend who's a priest, and I knew about 15 years ago that he'd be kind of moved over to the right wing on a number of things. And I was visiting him, and I mentioned that my daughter had just gotten married. And he said, "Oh, that's wonderful." And I said, "Well, and she married a woman." And I knew that he was very anti-gay. And he said, "Oh, I can't agree with that. I think that's just terrible, you know." And I said, "Well, you know, I changed her diapers, I taught her how to ride a bike, held her when she cried. She's my daughter, and I love her. What can I do?" And he had a daughter too. And he started sharing some of the things about his daughter and the things that he was not too happy about, et cetera, and so forth. And we let it lie. And he wrote me a letter about a month later, and he said, "I can see why God brought the two of us together. I never realized how narrow-minded I had become." And now he actually works with a lot of his right-wing church compatriots to begin to teach them about the more human element of these controversies. Because all of these elements, abortion, death penalty, war, they're all very human, and they make us very vulnerable to talk about them. So to share our vulnerability usually does not invite attack. If it does, then we know we don't want to continue that discussion with the person. But to be vulnerable with people really helps tremendously to find common ground.
It's almost a form of strength sometimes.
It's a form of strength.
Now, isn't that amazing?
Absolutely. It is.
As you open yourself up, that takes a great degree of confidence.
Absolutely.
And a sense of yourself. So it's almost kind of, you know, where words mean their opposite. It's like, you know, the vulnerability is the strength.
It's satyagraha. It's what Gandhi did. They opened themselves to the forces and said, "Kill us." And they couldn't do it. Yeah. Now, of course, there are many places in the world where they would have done it in a heartbeat. Well, so that's, you know, that doesn't always work. But,
right, it's situational.
Yeah. But generally in our culture, if we make ourselves vulnerable to somebody else, they respect that and they want to take care of us.
Well, and that builds on some of the things we had said in the early part of the interview about really respecting the other person. Yes. and being real people instead of sort of like the cardboard adversary that's, you know, a stereotypical, yeah, just a talking head kind of thing. And so the more real we can get, including sharing personal stories,
talk from the heart,
experiences, and so forth. Let's see what that note says. We're doing that okay. One of the methods that's interesting is this notion that George Lakoff has researched and written about framing, how you frame issues and how you reframe issues. And I want to just kind of explain the concept and then give some examples, and then we'll see what we can do. In George Lakoff's methodology, a frame is a cluster of consistent images or narratives that guides how people process information. So each frame relates to a deeply held value or worldview, and so the frame sort of is like, it gets wired into us about how we connect with the issue. So for example, people who, I'll give 3 examples, people who oppose governmental services frame taxation in terms of the tax burden and tax relief, relief from that burden. So taxes are a negative thing.
Right.
And so that makes them seem oppressive. And then folks who want the government to provide services that the public needs recognize that if the government's going to provide services, they got to have a revenue stream. So taxes, some people have said, are like the dues that we pay for living in a civilized society. You know, you want to have a fire department, you want to have streets, you want to have you know, services that we want. So some people will frame taxes as a burden, and other people would frame taxes as, here's a way that we share as a collaborative society to meet our needs. So, you know, and each one could lead different ways depending on how you use that example. Second example here is some people become extremely, extremely rich. And when they die, they leave an estate that people can inherit. And it seems reasonable that the system, the governmental and economic system that allowed them to become extremely rich, should be able to get a revenue stream recycled back into the system in the form of an estate tax, a tax that extremely rich people's estates would share with the government. But the politicians that side relentlessly with the extremely rich don't want that, so they call it a death tax, right? A couple of years ago, there was all this talk about the death tax.
Very powerful term.
And it was, yeah, and they reframed it because all of us have to die at some point, and so by calling it a death tax, made people psychologically identify with, holy crap, this thing could pertain to me, even though it's only for the tiny, tiny, tiny richest elite. And so they reframed it as a way to get more widespread opposition to an estate tax. Third example is mainstream politicians in the media keep saying that the United States has to show leadership in the world, that we're the one essential superpower, we have to do things, that somehow we have this entitlement as the shining beacon of liberty to, in effect, make other countries do what we want, what our government wants. And that frame is so much embedded in our cultural sense of who we are as a nation that people allow the government to go make wars against all kinds of other countries, overthrow democracies and install dictatorships and boss them around economically and politically and stuff, because we feel so entitled, because we see ourselves as the one nation that has to do...
American exceptionalism.
It's American exceptionalism. Rudyard Kipling referred to the white man's burden as an Englishman during the colonial era. I mean, there's that kind of arrogance.
We're number one.
We're number one. I mean, this comes out in so many ways, and so it gets embedded, and people don't even question it. But that's the kind of stuff that needs to get questioned and reframed.
And one of the difficulties with that, again, it's that whole epistemological problem of the simplistic reduction answer to questions. Anyone who appreciates the complexity of some of the questions of like international policy, taxes, is seen as waffling, is seen as not having any kind of a firm standpoint.
Yeah.
And anyone who takes a very firm, one-sided, diatribic standpoint is seen as strong, assertive, certain,
you're a strong leader.
That's the person you want to follow. So like after the whole 9/11 thing, when we heard we need a national dialogue about, forget it, that was considered to be weak and waffling, and no, we're going to go in there and we're going to solve it.
Yeah.
Well,
You're
now we all
with us or
recognize
against us.
Yeah.
Huge mistake.
Yeah, it's that polarization, you're with us or against us kind of thing that we don't allow any thoughtful conversation.
Yeah, remember the peace demonstrations we had after 9/11. People would, call us traitors to America. You hate America because you want to recognize the complexity.
Right.
It's hard. We don't like complexity. We like simplicity.
And they also reframed it so that you couldn't even discuss whether the war was a good idea, because they said support the troops. And when they said support the troops, they really meant support the war.
Right.
But they didn't want to have a debate about the war or even a conversation. And so they personalized it by saying, if you criticize this foreign policy, you're being disloyal to the troops.
That's right. You're not supporting. Right.
So that was a reframing that they did.
I have a short story about that.
Please.
A couple of years after 9/11, and U.S. Actually, it was also after the U.S. liberation / occupation of Iraq, and that's something I do in my classroom, give multiple sides of the issue. A group of our leadership students came to my classroom with a box of yellow ribbons and stick pins and asked if they could pass them out to the students. And I said, well, what does it symbolize? Said, well, support for the troops. I said, well, okay, I figured that, but support for the troops and the war, support the troops, not the war, what kind of support for the troops? How can you support the troops and not the war?
Bye.